Did you get my text?
No.
We'll use covered.
Covered.
Yeah.
Very good.
And that way, I mean, if anyone does ask after the fact,
No
you
problem.
know, we're not proactively
No problem.
showing. And then there will be a phone with Teams.
Sounds good. So we're doing DPD building on a stronger foundation today? No.
Hey, it's Robert. No, thank you. Right. Okay. Doug, can you get one more mic check, please? Thank you.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mic check, mic check.
Perfect. Thank
Okay,
you so
great.
much. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Do you want to give me an IFB or, I don't, thing is I need to listen to the.
Hi to those of you who are joining us on the Teams call.
Just go with that.
The phone will be on speaker, so you'll be able to ask questions when we get to that portion.
CBSN.
Just please mute your microphones until that time. Thanks.
Yeah.
Should we go?
Yeah, please. That'd be great. Thank you so much. Okay, appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye.
The mics are.
And I missed him, because I was at a hearing, so I couldn't even watch. He had to come down and get a major award. I was hoping it would be a leg lift. I walked up to him right now. Yeah, I said, I said, is it for G-leg? Yeah, I did take my house for a walk.
It's on.
It sits on my shoulder while I walk it. He's probably doing way too much. And he won't listen to me, but that's okay.
Let's change.
Exactly, he's big-headed. But he's been going to the, are you supposed to be getting your heart rate up? Even on a hard time? Are you supposed to be doing that? Are you supposed to be doing that? They said you could do some, but
How long have you been over there?
the day after his surgery, he had a heavy ball.
4 years.
Lying on the bed
4
doing
years,
stuff.
damn.
He has a heavy ball, he's tossed
Yeah, I
on it.
haven't seen
That's
you
great.
around more.
Drop it. Thanks.
Oh.
I know, isn't that a great?
Gotcha, okay.
Gosh, Ron, I
Gotcha.
told you that one now, let's find a better way.
That's cool. Yeah, cool.
Gotta get a few more documents signed, and then we'll, watch out for those heavy balls.
You guys doing the Periscope thing too?
We're just recording and then we're gonna upload to you later.
Gotcha.
He had a cold case?
Sir, how are you? Good to see you. You holding up all right? Yeah. Yeah, good. Surviving through times like this,
I forgot about that thing.
this is the craziest year of all time. Yeah.
Here for the folks joining us by phone, We'll be starting here in just a few minutes. We're just making sure that we don't have any late arrivals in the lobby. Just as a reminder, if you could please mute your line until it is time to ask a question. Thank you.
You were John Keith Citizen. Is he still doing blood center stuff? Or has that been so devalued now that it's still in your head and everybody understands? Last year?
Trust me, we all, yeah, we all do.
Are you serious?
It's my first year at contract quarter, so it's the first time career.
Like an episode of 40 Years Old? Are you sure you didn't watch this?
What are you gonna do?
Because he's here, so we're good. Well, his first.
Thank you.
Maybe just like temporary. No, it's my,
Never leave.
I'm gonna
You need a hurricane more
Brian
or
Weiss did
something.
keep up the good work. I interned at KMG 8 years ago. He's a rock star. I look up to that guy. Yeah, he really. I was really lucky to learn from him. Yeah.
Someone took a message out.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So much of fun. Yeah.
He brought it up.
Yeah.
He brought it up.
Good to see you. Yeah, good to see you out there, man. You as well. Thank you.
And I was like, I'll try to take a picture from
A little bit so it doesn't come through the microphone.
I like Zoom.
I think if you're doing a
Desktop.
Agreed. Thank you.
All right. I think we're ready to go, Lieutenant. Gentlemen, you both ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, you guys okay? Excellent, thanks. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Matt Clark. I'm a lieutenant with the Denver Police Department's Major Crimes Division. I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to provide an overview of the incident related to the police officer-involved shooting that occurred on Saturday, September 26, 2020, around 1:40 in the afternoon in the area of 37th Avenue and Vine Street. This is intended to be a preliminary briefing based upon information we have gathered after interviewing witnesses, speaking with the involved officers, and analyzing evidence collected from the scene. This investigation is in the early stages, and there may be questions I might not be able to answer at this point. With that being said, I'll give you a description of the incident and then take any questions at the end. On Saturday, September 26, 2020, around 1:38 in the afternoon, Denver's 911 Communications Center received a call regarding a male who was in the area of Russell Square Park, which is at 37th Avenue and Ray Street. The male was holding a knife. The caller further described the knife as a large butcher knife and reported that the male was waving it around. The caller expressed concern due to children being in the park. Denver police officers were promptly dispatched to the area. A uniformed patrol officer from District 2 was in the immediate area and quickly arrived at the location. The officer was driving a marked Denver police SUV and approached the park from the east. He traveled westbound on East 37th Avenue from Gaylord Street and stopped in the mid-2100 block of East 37th Avenue. And that'll put him between Vine and Gaylord Street on the north side of Russell Square Park. The officer observed a male subject standing on the southeast corner of 37th Avenue and Vine Street, holding a large knife in his right hand. The officer parked away from the subject and on the opposite side of the street to attempt to maintain distance. When the officer stepped out of his vehicle, the male subject turned his attention to the officer. Without warning, the male began charging at the officer while continuing to hold the knife in his right hand. As the male was sprinting towards the officer gave the male several loud commands directing him to drop the knife. The subject refused the officer's commands and continued advancing in a rapid manner and a threatening manner towards the officer. When the subject was within 12 to 15 feet of the officer discharged his weapon multiple times, striking the subject. The subject fell to the ground and dropped the knife next to his body. The officer immediately stopped firing his weapon when he recognized the subject had dropped the knife and was no longer a threat. The officer requested additional officers to respond and called for an ambulance for the subject. The involved officer immediately began rendering aid and continued doing so until the ambulance arrived. The subject was transported by ambulance to a local hospital where he remains in critical condition with potentially life-threatening injuries. To put this into perspective, just how quickly this incident occurred, I'd like to provide a preliminary timeline of events that was established through our review of computer-aided dispatch reports and body-worn camera timestamps. Again, the 911 call was received at 1:38. District 2 officers were dispatched 1 minute later at 1:39. The first officer arrived within a minute of that time. The officer exited his vehicle, begins verbally challenging the subject. Within 2 seconds, the subject is sprinting towards the officer. 4 seconds later, the officer discharged his weapon. Based upon preliminary measurements, the subject traveled approximately 45 feet in just under 4 seconds as he ran directly towards the officer. There was no available barrier, obstacle, or cover for the officer as the subject sprinted towards him. The officer involved in this incident was not injured. At the scene, investigators recovered a large machete with a black handle. The blade of the knife was 10 3/4 inches long. It was determined that the involved officer fired 7 rounds from his duty firearm. During the investigation, it was determined that one of the rounds fired by the officer struck a vehicle that was parked behind the suspect in the 3600 block of Vine Street. At the time, the vehicle was occupied by 2 individuals, an adult female in the passenger seat and a child in the back seat. The round that struck the vehicle impacted the driver's door and became lodged in the steering column. The driver's position of the vehicle was unoccupied at the time, and fortunately, none of the occupants in the vehicle were injured in this incident. The officer involved in the incident was equipped with a body-worn camera, and the camera captured the interaction between the subject and the officer. As part of the investigation, multiple civilian witnesses were interviewed as part of this investigation. In reference to the involved officer, again, the officer was wearing a standard Denver Police uniform and was driving a marked Denver Police SUV. The officer is assigned to the Patrol Division in District 2 and has been with the Denver Police Department since 2018. That officer has not been involved in a prior officer-involved shooting incident, and the officer will be working in a modified duty assignment. The subject in this case has been identified as 30-year-old Eber Gonzalez. He spells it H-E-B-E-R, Gonzalez, G-O-N-Z-A-L-E-Z. Date of birth is August 10th of 1990. Mr. Gonzalez is currently being held for investigation of first-degree assault to a peace officer, felony menacing, and possession of a weapon by a previous offender. The investigation of this critical incident is being conducted by the Denver and Aurora Police Department homicide units, as well as the Denver District Attorney's Office. The investigation is being monitored by the Office of the Independent Monitor, which is a civilian entity. I would encourage anyone with information about this incident or any video of this incident to contact the Denver Police Department or Crime Stoppers so that information may be included in our investigation. I'd be happy to address any questions you may have.
Right now, the independent monitor and internal affairs, are we talking about the same thing, or are you guys having an independent, or is IA involved in this typically, is that protocol?
So there's 2 investigations that run concurrently. The criminal investigation takes the lead at this point, and the administrative one will it's a handoff process. Once the district attorney renders a decision, then internal affairs will begin their investigation. Despite the break in the investigations, the Office of the Independent Monitor has oversight of the entire investigative process, the criminal and the administrative component.
Has it been determined yet whether or not the rules of engagement, according to the department, were followed at this point, or does that take more investigating at this point to get there?
So again, this is meant to be just a factual overview and not to draw any conclusions regarding the officer's actions. That is well down the road. And administratively, that will come after the district attorney's decision.
Is there at any point in which this officer but was that an option for this officer at that time?
The officer was carrying a taser. The officer determined that was not the appropriate response based on this individual sprinting towards him and giving him essentially no time to respond any other way to stop a deadly threat.
And I guess we will see body cam video today?
I will show you today, I'll show you some screenshots that were taken from the officer's body camera. After the decision letter from the district attorney comes out, the body camera will be released in full.
And this all happened pretty quick, apparently. What was the demeanor of the subject at the time of the incident? Could you characterize that for me in any way?
Sure, so it was tough to assess for the officer because it happened so quickly. There was no verbal interaction back and forth. All he literally sees is an individual running at him with a butcher knife that is a blade of 10 3/4 inches. The caller also could not assess what the individual's demeanor was other than to say he was waving the knife around.
And as far as these briefings are concerned, this is an effort to be more transparent. We've always had press briefings and we've always talked about these things after they happen, but is this part of a new protocol with the department now for you guys to release what you can and be as transparent as possible? Can you talk to that?
Sure, I wouldn't characterize this as new. This is something the Denver Police Department has done quite regularly within several days of a police shooting incident. Sometimes there's a delay based on the officers deferring their statement. We want to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the investigation and provide the best information when we do provide these briefings. So it's not necessarily new for us. There's certainly a concerted effort within the department to be transparent. We recognize the gravity of these situations, the concern that comes anytime an officer discharges their weapons. So that is part of the effort to provide information, and as we move forward, there will be additional opportunities for that as well.
What else should people know? Were there any other aggravating circumstances that might have contributed to what happened that day? Is there anything else that you can provide the public to better understand the situation and the response from the department?
So as far as aggravating factors, I can't speak to. We're still looking into the background of the individual, what, if any, substances may have contributed to his behavior that day. And then as far as the department's response, that will certainly be reviewed, both from a debriefing with the officers and then a tactical response from a larger perspective within the agency.
Is there anything else, Sir Joe? Did you have anything?
Yeah, just a quick question. I probably already mentioned, but just wanted to make sure. As far as the officer involved, how long has he been with the department, and has he been placed on administrative leave? Or?
So he's been on our department since 2018, and it's not an administrative leave per se. It's a modified duty status. So he's not working in a patrol capacity, but he is still working within the department in a different capacity now. I can, if there's no, I can jump back to the phone, or I can show some quick slides briefly to put into perspective some of what I just described. This first slide that I'll show is the subject. Again, the officer had parked on the north curb line in the 2100 block of East 37th Avenue. The subject in this frame is on the grass between the sidewalk and the road. He actually started back by Vine and has closed the distance at this point and is coming towards the officer. Here's a zoomed in image of that, and the knife is in his right hand, and you can see the length of that blade there as he's approaching the officer. And this is the only slide I'm going to show relative to him. I'll give you perspective on the knife that the officer, that the individual was racing and charging at the officer with. That was captured at location and documented by our crime lab unit. And then to put it into additional perspective, there's a scale ruler to provide perspective. Any other questions I can answer?
Would it be reasonable to ask if that knife was smaller? Do you think the officer's reaction might have been different if he just had like a pocket knife as opposed to a larger? I mean, that's a full machete, right? I mean, we're talking. That's a very menacing looking
right.
weapon. Does that fall into consideration at some point? I guess is that.
I don't know if I could answer that
Okay,
because there's still an active threat coming at the officer, and an officer may perceive a deadly threat regardless of the length of the blade there.
Could you go back to that first slide, please, where the subject was running? Great. And these are the only two that you're going to release at this juncture, is that correct?
Yeah, so again, and this photo is not him moving, that's a zoomed-in image of him from the original one, just to highlight the knife. But this is the image that we're releasing at this point, showing the individual in stride, approaching the officer's direction.
Go to the next slide, possibly. Thank you. Just want to leave that up for like a minute. Thank you.
How many officer-involved shootings has the Denver Police been involved this year compared to last year or previous years? Has it been greater or less?
So it's actually, it's at this point in the year, it's pretty close. This year, we've had 10 police officer-involved shootings involving Denver officers. 7 of those occurred in the city of Denver, 3, and then we had a couple that occurred outside. And then last year, for the entire year, Denver had 11 police officer-involved shootings.
And what are you guys doing differently, if anything, right now when it comes to these circumstances? I know it's a tough situation. You don't have a lot of time to react oftentimes. But what have any of the protocols changed? Is there anything else you want the public to know about how you guys are approaching these subjects in these situations now? Is there something important to take away for the public?
Yeah, I think when time allows, when circumstances are such that it allows, officers are employing de-escalation techniques. The officer involved in this and any officer involved in our recent police shootings did not come to work wanting to be in a police shooting and having to deal with the aftermath of that. They're doing everything they can to de-escalate. The department has taken great strides to using our co-responder model, our clinicians, to make sure that the right people are going to the right calls. This was a dangerous encounter with an edged weapon, a deadly weapon that happened very rapidly.
What else should we do?
I have a question.
I got one on the phone. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Esteban over at Denver. Can you just describe a little bit what happened with the car that had 2 people in it? You said one of the cops' rounds made it into the car. How many times did the officer shoot his weapon?
The officer discharged his weapon 7 times. We determined that one of the rounds did strike the vehicle, which was beyond the suspect, past the suspect. I don't believe the officer, based on the distance, would have had any knowledge that that vehicle was occupied, although it was occupied.
And those people are okay? Were they clear at the scene? Or?
They were. There was, my understanding is they actually didn't know their car had been struck until they got back to their residence and found the defect in the car. The individuals inside the car were not injured. The round entered the driver's door and lodged in the steering column of the car.
But they were inside the car when the round went into their car?
That's correct. There was an adult female in the front passenger seat and a child in the back seat.
They had no connection to any...
We have made no connection between them and anybody involved in this incident.
As far as the type of call that the 911 dispatch center received, a man holding a possible knife, why not send 2 officers right away instead of 1?
Multiple officers were dispatched to this call from the onset. This officer happened to be in very close proximity. The officer knew that the park, Russell Square Park, is typically occupied by families on a Saturday afternoon, and that was further corroborated and reinforced by the callers expressing her concern that there were multiple children in the park in the vicinity of this individual. So the officer determined it was most appropriate to respond directly to address it before anybody got hurt.
Can you repeat the name of the subject that is DLB and the charges one more time, please?
Yes, sir. Eber, he spells it H-E-B like boy, E-R, H-E-B-E-R. Gonzalez, G-O-N-Z-A-L-E-Z. His birth date is August 10th of 1990. He's being held for investigation of first-degree assault to a peace officer, felony menacing, possession of a weapon by a previous offender.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.